From Atlanta, Georgia, welcome to Fearfully and Wonderfully Me, a podcast for women on leadership and life skills with Rhea Story. Rhea shares powerful life and leadership principles, helping you maximize your potential and become the woman God created you to be.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Fearfully and Wonderfully Me, a podcast designed to help you become the leader you are destined to be. Today's episode is one of my favorites to do. Every year at the end of the year, I kind of do just a mini recap of the books that I read in 2022 and tell you a little bit about some of the ones that were more powerful. Now, it's all relative. When I name this podcast episode Best Books of 2022, that's pretty subjective, right? Because when you read a book and you're at a certain point in your life, it will have some meaning to you. But if you read that book at a different point in your life, it might mean more to you, or it might not be quite as applicable to where you are at that situation or that particular moment and season of your life. So, best is very relative and very subjective. But the way I qualify best is, did it give me a new thought or a new perspective? Did it help me think about something differently? So that's kind of, or was it just unique? So that's kind of just how I come up with what hits on my list of the best books of 2022. I did a podcast earlier in the year. I talked about a couple that I was reading probably midsummer. And sometimes it's nice to just share with you what I'm reading, what I get. I know a lot of you are interested in, well, obviously you're interested in personal growth. That's why you're listening to this podcast. But I know a lot of you are readers, and so if I find a book that was valuable for me, I love to just share that with my tribe and say, hey, I got something out of this. Maybe you will as well. So here we go, digging into some of the best books of 2022. Number one, this was a book I actually reread, but it was so good the first time I read it that I reread it again this year. And again, sometimes when you reread a book and you're at a different place, you get something different from the book. So I reread The Five Levels of Attachment by Don Miguel Ruiz Jr. And this book really deals with the levels of attachment that we create, consciously or not, to some portion of our identity. And really fantastic, deep thinking book. It's a small book, it's not a big book, but it really requires some thought. It's not necessarily a light, fluffy read. The levels themselves are pretty straightforward. But the deep thought for me comes in thinking about how this applies to my life, to my situation. Now, the reason this is important, he uses the levels of attachment. He uses a sports analogy. And I will kind of just quickly summarize it. He talks about level one, level of attachment. He calls that authentic self. You have no attachment to a particular sports team, for example. So if somebody invites you to the ball game, you show up, you don't care who wins or loses, you can just enjoy the outing. Well, at level two, he calls that the preference level. So maybe you still aren't a particular fan of a sports team, but somebody invites you to the game and you say, oh, I'm going to cheer for the red team because they're wearing red jerseys and I like red. And so you have a little preference as to whether they win or lose, but it is just a preference, right? It doesn't really affect your emotions if they win or lose. It was just an arbitrary decision. So you can engage with the experience in a very healthy way. It doesn't wreck your life if the outcome's not what you want. Well, at level three, he calls this the identity level, and this is where things change a little bit. At level three, this is kind of where the game changes. I start to form some sense of my identity as being a sports fan. So maybe now I'm a uh, Alabama fan, and I'm at an Alabama game, and the ref made a bad call on us. Right. So you see how the game changes. Is now I've started to identify as a fan of that particular sports team. And so if things don't go my way, it's affecting me because that's part of my identity. Things aren't necessarily still things can still be okay and not necessarily too unhealthy at this level. We just have to be careful because the next level is level four. internalization. And this is where we forget that we have a choice to be an Alabama fan or a Georgia fan or a um, uh, Auburn Tigers fan, right? At this point, we've internalized that sense of identity so much that not only does it affect us emotionally if the game doesn't go our way, but we've forgotten that we have the power to choose something different. And then level 5 is, I think he calls this one fanatical, where, this level of attachment is where we see people get into fights or kill each other because of a football game, or somebody gets so depressed because their team is having a bad season, they could think about taking their life, right? I mean, this is taking that to an extreme. Now, that might sound kind of absurd to you, depending on where you are in sports, but you think of the levels of attachment applied to politics or religion, or one of the things I think is most powerful for me is applying the levels of attachment to what I call the victim mindset. And you've heard me talk about the victim mindset over and over and over. And a lot of times, what I think is that when something traumatic happens to us, when something bad happens to us, we immediately start to go to level 3 or level 4 with an attachment to a sense of identity as a victim. And at level 3, we identify as a victim. At level 4, we internalize that and we forget that we have the power to set that victim mindset down and walk away from it. And the power for me is realizing we don't have to choose that mindset, right? So again, I really enjoyed the 5 levels of attachment. It was a reread for me. I might have talked about it in previous podcasts because I just think it was so powerful when we think about the attachments that we have to our sense of identity and how those can be healthy for us, how those can serve us, or how maybe we need to rethink them. So that was book number 1. Book number 2, this one was a little bit different because typically, my personal growth goal is 50 nonfiction books a year, and that's the only qualification is just nonfiction. And it might be a book on running, it might be a book on nutrition for my physical wellness, it might be a book like the one I just talked about for my emotional wellness, personal growth or leadership, a lot of historical books that I enjoy reading because I learn a lot. But this one was a little different because it's kind of half fiction, kind of half nonfiction, but I still wanted to go on and include it on this list, and I'll share with you why. The book is called Love Letters by Joe Castillo. And I actually had the privilege of meeting Mr. Castillo. He sort of lives in this metro Atlanta area, and um, he's an artist, and creates incredible art in sand. And that sounds a little strange, but basically he draws this beautiful picture in sand, and underneath the shadow box where he's drawing in the sand is a projector, and so that image is then projected up onto a screen, and he tells a story as he does this. And so it's kind of a very fascinating form of art in and of itself, but it really draws you in. But anyway, this book that he wrote was sort of a parable, but sort of a fictional story about a young lady. But where the nonfiction part comes in is he weaves quite a lot of scripture into the story. And so the storyline goes that this young lady is like a villager. She's, basically a nobody with no future back when, servants were around, and she's working like at the as a scullery maid or something like that at the castle. And this old lady comes to her and says, the prince wants to marry you, he's fallen in love with you. And the girl goes, what, he doesn't even know me? And she says, yes, and here's a book of letters he's written to you. And the book of love letters, quote unquote, is actually a parable for God's message to us, and Jesus's love for us. And so the whole storyline goes as the young lady is searching for her prince, and she has to grow through the experience and keep herself on the right path. She has to, take a long journey of growth, and she has to fight some battles and make some right choices. And so it was a really good um, parable. an analogy for our growth as a Christian, particularly if you like, kind of a fairy tale story. It was a really good way to weave the scripture in a way, and the story and the analogy in a way that it just was beautiful. So really well written. I would definitely recommend this book for a teenage girl, particularly if you're of a Christian faith, because it really had a little bit of a romance. And then, at the end, you realize that the whole concept of sacrifice and unconditional love was really the girl realizing that she didn't have to, do anything to earn the love. It was unconditional. So, really good there again, especially for a teenage girl. And Mr. Castillo donates, I think, maybe all of the profits of this to one of the ministries here locally that provides services to young girls who've been rescued from sex trafficking. So, really good book, but also a really good cause there as well. So, those were kind of the top two that stick out. Now, some of the others, there again, my only qualification for books on this list is nonfiction, and I really enjoyed "Don't Settle for Safe" by Sarah Jakes Roberts. And this book, I just got a lot of really good quotes and nuggets out of this book. And I'm not looking at my Kindle, so I can't share all of those with you. But some really good quotes and some really good thoughts that she had on um, boundaries and relationships. And the one quote that really sticks out and stands out when I think about this book is she talks about don't start a relationship with someone you wouldn't want to become. And that was powerful for me because a lot of times we'll have um, friends or the beginning of a relationship, maybe even a romantic relationship. But I think that anytime we're creating a relationship or a bond with somebody, it's important to think about, does that person have the values that are important to us? Do they have the values that we admire and respect and aspire to in ourselves? Um, and a lot of times I think we ignore little red flags in relationships. And that quote just really reminded me, hey, don't get into a relationship with that person if you wouldn't want to be them, right? If you don't want to act like them or think like them or eat like them. And I've said it before, but we become like the people we spend the most time with. So, very important there. She had some other really great points in the book. It was just a really good personal growth. I would probably look for more books by her. This was the first book I'd actually read by her. I think it came on my Kindle Unlimited or Kindle Prime. And so, I'm always looking for great books that come through unusual channels, and this was one of them. So, all right, just a couple more that I wanted to share with you. Um, I read several not maybe not historical, but several, memoirs or autobiographies. And there again, I learn so much from them. But one of the books, actually, this wasn't an autobiography; it was a biography by Doris Kearns Goodwin, and the book was "Leadership in Turbulent Times." And to me, this really wasn't as much of a leadership book as it was a historical account. But she basically chose four presidents: um, Eisenhower, the two Roosevelts, and Lincoln. And she shared with you, starting in boyhood and all the way through their presidency, um, incidences that shaped them, that affected them, that shaped their political and foundation and beliefs, things that shaped their decisions, um, particularly. And, obviously, all of these four men were leaders in very turbulent times in our nation's history. So there were some good um leadership lessons, obviously, in looking at these leaders, but you really had to dig them out. It was more of an account, and you got to learn the lessons of leadership, but you had to be looking for them. She doesn't necessarily break them down as leadership principles, but still, it was a great, there again, historical book. I learned a lot about each of the four presidents. Even though I'd done some, particularly Lincoln, I'd done some reading on him, but it was interesting to see the comparison of the four, how different they were, why, what influenced them over the course of their life. And then, um, last but not least, the probably the last book that I just wanted to share with you today was actually a book called Runaway Girl. Carissa Phelps wrote it, and Carissa is now sort of probably fairly well known in the circle of an advocate for adoption, foster care, but also particularly in trafficking, which is the circle that I first became aware of Carissa. And I really enjoyed her. It's an autobiography, and it's about her story of, you know, growing up in a troubled household and running away, and then making some poor choices and ending up in, foster care and custody of the state, and then being victimized. And there again, she shares pretty authentically and honestly some of the choices that she made, and that they weren't great choices, and certainly didn't lead to great circumstances. But I think it was really powerful from the perspective of being able to understand maybe what it's like for someone who hasn't been in some of those situations. It even helped me just kind of think through, well, what would I do if I were in that situation? Because a lot of times as adults, particularly, we look back at teenagers and why do they make the decisions they make, and we don't really understand. And so it just kind of gave me a little bit of a frame of reference for sometimes why particular teenagers who've been through something hard maybe already, um, why they respond to that trauma in the way that they do, or why did they make the decisions that to adults or their parents may make absolutely no sense. Um, but at the time, that was the decision that was made. The other thing that really struck me about this book is she mentions how impactful some, teachers and some mentors were for her. And that struck with me personally because I do a lot of mentoring, and I do a lot of work with girls who've been rescued from sex trafficking. And sometimes it's easy to feel like, I don't know if I'm making an impact with someone. I don't know if I'm making necessarily a difference with this person, or maybe I just don't feel like I'm able to help that person. But, she shares that sometimes those teachers or mentors or the people that speak into our lives are making a difference. They just don't know it yet, or that seed hasn't sprouted yet. And so that really was a good reminder for me, just to remember that when we pour into someone, whether it's your kids or you mentoring somebody else or working with troubled teens or any teens, that we are planting seeds, and it might take years for them to sprout. But in Carissa's case, I mean, it was literally years. She talks about one particular mentor who, poured into her and poured into her and just believed in her and encouraged her. But it was a couple of years before she was finally willing to trust that person enough to reach out and accept the help that they were offering, and accept that they were believing in her because they saw her for her potential. So there again, really just a good inside frame of reference for some of, a lot of times if we haven't been through a situation, it's difficult to think through what, looking at that with hindsight or the benefit of perspective. We think, why would somebody do that, or why would they act like that? And so again, just a good frame of reference and a change of perspective. And that's one of the reasons I love reading autobiographies, or biographies, is because we get to learn so much about individuals, and individuals who've been, gone on to be great leaders, and individuals that, you know, have done great things, but they've overcome something. Um, and that really helps us learn in a powerful way. Just it helps change our paradigm and helps us learn sometimes to have more empathy with a person. Um, Not necessarily sympathy, right? Not necessarily agreeing, but empathy is the ability to step inside someone else's shoes and see things from their frame of reference and go, "Oh, okay." And then we can apply the 7 habits. Seek first to understand, then be understood. And so I think that's powerful to remember why we should read other people's stories. And not only can we learn from them from our own journey, but it also helps us develop a more empathetic mindset of what would it be like to look at things from the other side of the window. So there you are. Some of the books that really struck me and why this year. I'm not quite done with my reading list. I always set the goal for 50 nonfiction books of uh, the year, and it's December as this podcast episode is coming out, and I still have a few weeks to go in my reading, but I still have a couple more books um, on my reading list before I get to my 50. But that's okay. I wanted to go ahead and do this podcast episode and release that as just the season starts to wrap up and we start thinking ahead to 2023 and what that might look like. These might be some good books that you might want to put on your reading list. Until next time.
Start increasing your influence and maximizing your potential with Ria's audiobooks. Available at audible.com, amazon.com, and iBooks. Please visit riastory.com to learn about Ria's books, resources, speaking, and training programs. Thanks for listening.